conflict in the Middle East, and the energy crisis of the 1970s. The 1970s was a decade of ideological, militaristic, and economic concerns that shaped U.S. involvement in the Middle East both then and now, with several oil crises in the region eventually sparking a national energy crisis. In an address to the nation on April 30, 1970, Richard Nixon emphatically claimed that if, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world. He, along with the rest of the world, had witnessed a chaotic yet very profitable and resource-rich landscape emerge in the Middle East, and was determined to harness its power and provide favorable stability in the region in order to protect American interests in the area. Nixon hoped that the American economy would be stimulated by the spread of Western ideology and diplomatic alliances with powerful Iranians and other Middle Eastern leaders. This plan would completely backfire, resulting in an economically devastating energy crisis and increased violence and unrest in the Middle East. President Nixon's first interest was international relations. This often put a strain on domestic policy. He used his relationship with China, which had been improved by a visit to Beijing to meet with Mao Zedong in February of 1972, to pressure the Soviets into agreeing to a treaty that limited anti-ballistic missiles, thereby stagnating the arms race. By the end of the strategic arms limitation talks, known as SALT I, the U.S. secured Soviet consent to freeze the number of ballistic missiles carrying nuclear warheads. Although this certainly did not end the arms race, it was a significant step towards reducing Cold War tensions and bringing about a détente in the Middle East. With the emergence of a recession in the 1970s, the U.S. economy faced the unusual combination of economic slowdown and high inflation, a condition that became known as stagflation, which is a combination of inflation and stagnation. In August 1971, Nixon introduced a plan that, in part, created a 10% surtax on all imports, improving the U.S. balance of trade with foreign competitors. By 1972, the recession was over, and Nixon was re-elected thanks in no small part to his foreign policy successes in China and the Soviet Union. Then, in the same year, the Watergate scandal gripped the nation. Watergate paralyzed the political system in the mid-1970s, a critical time both at home and overseas. The nation was deprived of respected, strong, and confident leadership during one of the most crucial times for American foreign policy in history. The Middle East was in disarray, and American interference seemed imminent. The War Powers Act, which was passed in 1973, required the President to report to Congress within 48 hours of taking military action and made it so that Congress would have to approve any military action that lasted more than 60 days. The War Powers Act was crucial to American participation in the Middle East in that the American people and government believed that the act would initiate more stability and consistency in American military participation. Arguably the most important event of 1973 was the outbreak of the October War in the Middle East, which would drag the United States through hell and back. On October 6, the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, Syrian and Egyptian forces launched a surprise attack on Israel in an attempt to recover lands lost in the Six-Day War of 1967. As a major proponent of Israeli independence, President Nixon prepared nuclear forces for the worst and airlifted approximately $2 billion in arms to Israel. With the extensive support, Israel made quick work of its opponents and the war concluded rather quickly. The U.S. paid an enormous price for supporting Israel, however. The Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries placed an embargo on oil sold to Israel supporters, including the United States. In 1973, Arab nations supplied 37% of the oil consumed by the non-communist world. Therefore, the embargo caused a worldwide oil shortage and long lines at gas stations in the United States. In the 3 frenzied months after the embargo was announced, the price of oil shot from $3 per barrel to $12. The U.S. economy became a victim of hyperinflation, a loss of manufacturing jobs, and a drastic decrease in the standard of living for blue-collar workers. Inflation slowed economic growth as consumers and businesses couldn't afford the high prices and interest rates that plagued the country. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board attempted to reduce inflation by making interest rates even higher, ultimately culminating in a 20% increase by 1980. However, these rates did a significant amount of damage to the automobile and building industries as consumers switched from big American-made cars to smaller, more fuel-efficient Japanese cars. U.S. automobile workers alone lost over 225,000 jobs, and Congress created a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit to save gasoline. Furthermore, an expensive pipeline in Alaska meant to tap American oil reserves was commissioned and approved, and local, state, and national leaders called for additional measures to conserve energy, asking gas stations to close on Sundays and homeowners to refrain from putting up holiday lights on their houses. To make matters worse, middle-class taxpayers were pushed into higher tax brackets, and economic unrest forced the government to further its social programs. Americans had to face the fact that, for the first time since World War II, their standard of living was on the decline. Nothing the government tried could catalyze the sluggish economy or stem high inflation rates, which continued to the end of the decade. By 1980, the federal deficit was nearly $60 billion, and recovery seemed impossible. The rapid and unpredicted collapse of the economy, along with the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation in 1974, created a growing loss of faith in the federal government. However, faith was not lost in the Republican Party quite yet, as the second consecutive Republican president, Gerald Ford, was chosen as Nixon's successor. A new leader did not indicate new strides in economic recovery, however. Inflation continued, and the economy drove deeper into recession as the unemployment rate skyrocketed to 9%. Despite a lack of economic growth and change, ideological alterations were on the horizon. Jimmy Carter, a staunch Democrat, was elected in 1976. His informal style marked the temporary end of the era of imperial presidency. Rather than supporting a foreign policy built upon economic growth, Carter's foreign policy was founded on securing human rights for everyone. In his first and only term as President of the United States, his greatest achievement was arranging a peace settlement between Egypt and Israel known as the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords, which were created between 1978 and 1979, forced Israel to withdraw its troops from the Sinai Territory and other regions conquered from Egypt in exchange for Egyptian recognition of Israel as a nation. Although most of the Arab world, particularly the Palestine Liberation Organization, opposed the treaty, it was the first significant step towards effective peace negotiations in the Middle East. The violence and frustration of U.S. involvement in the Middle East during the 1970s culminated in the Iranian hostage crisis. In 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini led a group of Iranian Islamic fundamentalists in the overthrowing of the Iranian government. The overthrown government, which had been put in place in 1951 by the CIA and British intelligence in an attempt to give power to Iranian leadership that was receptive to Western ideas, had kept open commerce with the West during the 1970s, but this flow of oil and Western ideas alienated a powerful portion of the Iranian population. Khomeini and his fundamentalist allies attempted to cut ties with the West by halting Iranian oil production, resulting in the second worldwide oil shortage of the decade. On November 4th, a group of Iranian students called the Muslim Student Followers of the Imam's Line captured the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. For 444 days, they held 52 embassy staff hostage in what became known as the Iran hostage crisis. In the United States, the hostage-taking was seen as a flagrant violation of international law and aroused intense anger and anti-Iranian sentiments, while the attack was extremely popular in Iran. Carter's popularity plummeted as Americans expressed heavy anti-Iranian sentiments that he could not control. Khomeini claimed that the seizure of the Great Satan Embassy had many benefits, that it united their people, and that their opponents did not dare attack them, essentially sending the U.S. a message that the new Iran was not afraid of the superpower. Amid the Iranian Revolution that gripped Iranian politics and economics during 1979, inconsistency and decreased volumes of oil produced and exported from Iran created an overall loss in OPEC's oil production by about 4%, driving the price of oil up far higher than normal. The hostage crisis was resolved in 1981 with the Algiers Accords, which essentially stated that hostility between Iran and the U.S. would be forcibly decreased. The U.S. would remove trade sanctions on Iran and stop intervening in the country's affairs, and Iran would pay its debts to the United States. However, the Iraqi invasion of Iran ensured that the energy crisis would at least partially bleed into the next decade, although other countries began to fill the production shortfalls and the crisis eventually was resolved. During the last few years of the 1970s, American relations with the Soviet Union had also deteriorated. The U.S. Senate's failure to ratify the SALT II treaty in 1979, which would have limited each country's nuclear delivery system, led to a renewal of tensions over Afghanistan. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and all efforts to improve relations during the 70s were destroyed. Fearing Soviet domination of the oil-rich Persian Gulf, Carter placed an embargo on grain exports and the sale of high technology to the Soviet Union, initiating a new arms buildup. The 1970s energy crisis may have ended at the turn of the decade, but the resulting national deficit and hostilities around the Middle East were doomed to continue, neither having ceased in the year 2017. To this day, ensuring stability in the oil industry of the Middle East factors heavily in the development of U.S. foreign policy in the region.